Is our current regime legitimate? If not, what regime level changes would you implement, sir?
Legitimate. Okay, I'm going to give a geek answer, in part so that I can remain just on the side of the Overton window that is required to keep my current institutional affiliations. Aristotle gives an answer on legitimacy that's kind of circular or yin-yang or chicken-egg or whatever, right? The two things that make for legitimacy, one is longevity and the other is good government. So a king who's been around, a 10th generation monarch is legitimate simply because the family has been around for a long time. But if he governs poorly, he becomes over time illegitimate, and it's the right of revolution is therefore justified in casting him out. I just happened the other day to be looking at Shakespeare's Richard II, which is kind of what this play is about, right? Is Richard II legitimate? Now, if everybody, I don't know if anybody remembers the play, but the short answer is the dude gets deposed and is replaced by Henry IV. And Shakespeare seems to think that Richard is legitimate in the legal sense, right? He inherited it legitimately. He's from a line and so on, but he governs so poorly that it is just to kick him out because he's basically a tyrant, right? So, and then you have to ask yourself the question, and Aristotle sort of explores this, which is, well, where does longevity can't be the full and final answer because every regime had to originate somewhere, it had to be founded, right? It either was, founded like ours, like the American regime was founded, or it's founded by some heroic king or whatever. Right. So where does legitimacy originally come from? And it comes from replacing the bad with the good, or at least the worse with the better, for good intentions, and building on those good intentions with good institutions, good government, and so on into the future. Right. Well, the American regime has been around for a while. It's actually fairly long lived as far as a republic goes. The oldest written constitution currently observed anywhere in the world. And as far as I know, the oldest written constitution ever observed in the history of the world. So we're at 246 plus years. On the longevity question, we'd have to say the American regime is legitimate. On the good government question, I would say the answer is quite a lot shakier. It's not governing well. It hasn't been governing well for a while. It also, as I mapped out, I think with some detail, lots of detail in my book, in particular, chapter 3, the stakes, the book is called, it doesn't govern according to the way it says it governs. So the United States was founded according to certain principles and certain rules. There's written law, there's the Constitution, there's the Bill of Rights, all this statute law. And the regime as it actually operates willfully, routinely ignores those things, contradicts them, does end runs around them. And then the final thing I will say on the legitimacy question is, there's nothing in the original conception of the American regime that would enable or allow or encourage all this power sharing with big corporations and non-governmental entities with no democratic buy-in, that just exercise plenary powers, either regardless of the will of the people or often in direct contravention to the will of the people. So those things would tell against the American regime's legitimacy. So I think that's a fairly, it's a somewhat difficult question to answer, but if someone is looking, my enemies, we might say, are looking for a pat yes. And any suggestion that there might be some problems with the American regime's legitimacy is just proof that you're a fill in the blank. But I think anybody who could give you a pat yes to that question in 2021 is either a fool or a liar.
Well, one way to summarize it, my response might be to say that Michael is more of an Aristotelian and perhaps more of a Platonist. I should also point out that it's very easy to tell that Michael is a lib because he's broadcasting with a copy of Emile in his background. But I have a very different answer, which
grad
is
school,
that,
man. I saved all my books.
I know. That's. I was expecting that was the answer. It's a very plausible answer. We won't ask again. But you could. I mean, never too late for a change. But in any case, when I think about legitimacy, I think about it in a much more sort of Platonist, Schmittian, Machiavellian kind of sense. And my view is that yes, the regime is absolutely legitimate because it is much more legitimate legitimacy is not a unipolar question. If you're comparing the legitimacy of Richard II to that of Henry the Fourth, that's a bipolar question. Is Henry the Fourth more legitimate than Richard II? Is Henry the Seventh more legitimate than Richard III? Very questionable little invasion he pulled there. But he succeeds, and because of his power, his regime becomes, completely legitimate. And because Richard III is killed in the battle, there is no competing source of legitimacy. So, I would ask those who consider the American regime to be illegitimate to say, okay, what other regime would you prefer? Is there another, could the Canadians perhaps be in charge, the Australians? And there's simply no plausible answer to that question. There's simply no plan B. There's no regime B. There's no alternative people. There's no alternative ideas. There's basically no alternative nothing. And so that, to me, makes the regime completely illegitimate. If we compare that to the collapse of various recent regimes, for example, regimes that felt, as tangible and as solid and as permanent as ours, East Germany, the USSR, then even the Third Reich, then you see that those regimes basically had very, very tangible alternatives. East Germany has West Germany, the East has the West. And so they're like, when the USSR falls, it falls not of its own volition, but because it falls of the kind of the gravitational pull of this other model. And so the main thing for me that supports the legitimacy of the regime is simply the absence of an alternative. And any regime will be completely legitimate in the absence of an alternative.
So I'm not sure that there is an absence of an alternative. Now, in the Cold War sense that Curtis is talking about, of course there is, because if you look around, everybody who's let's say, every conservative who's dissatisfied with the present state of America, and they think, I have to get out of here. You hear people mouth off like this sometimes. At least I do. Maybe that depends on who you hang out with. But then you think, well, where are you going to go? Right? Is there some country somewhere that is closer to 1776, 1787, 1870, post-Civil War amendments, America functioning the way it's supposed to function without all of these layers of stuff that's been accrued in the past couple of generations. You look around the world, doesn't seem like it, right? Now,
right.
However, we know that this thing could exist because it has existed in the past. And so the alternative, I'm not sure, has to be something that you could literally pack your bags and flee to now. It could be something that could be a real possible successor. And then one other point I'd make very quickly is one of the things that made the regimes Curtis was talking about, late Soviet Union, the East Germany, illegitimate in the 80s, second half of the 80s when all of this was coming apart, was the fact that the people en masse had stopped believing anything that came from the government. I don't know that that's true in the United States to say that like 80, whatever, it's not 70, it's not 80%, it's not 90%, but something like 40%, maybe close to 50%, just don't believe things that they hear from the government or from the media or from official power centers anymore. They know they're being lied to. They know that there's nothing they really can do about the lies. That is, they can't challenge it and force the truth out, but they're tuning it out. And the more that happens, I mean, look at all of those trust metrics that places like the Pew Research Center do. There's almost no power center in American society, whether it be governmental, university, corporate, media, you name it, that's in positive territory. And most of them are absolutely in horrifically bad, tens, teens, and around there. That, and even if it's only, like I say, a plurality of the people who just don't believe anything that the government tells them anymore, or the universities or the media tells them anymore. That's a legitimacy crisis in and of itself, because it means at a minimum, you've got a completely bifurcated population, one of which believes it all and wants to tell you must believe, and the other of which just doesn't believe it and can't be forced to believe. So I don't know if we'll get to the, USSR circa 1987 point where it's the vast majority of the population knows everything is a lie, but I think you have a legitimacy problem even if 40% or 50% believes it's all a lie.
Can I push back on that a little?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Well, again, I take a much more Schmittian kind of realist approach to legitimacy than you do. And so when you talk about, things like majorities, I'm like, well, what you're doing there is you're weighting the whole population equally. And in reality, all societies are ruled by small minorities, and we have a small minority ruling class here, which is essentially the institute, the PMC, the professional mercantile class, as the super libs call it, and that's maybe 5 to 10% of the population that are core members of that, and then 20% that are aspirational members of that. And you see that for example, there was a very fascinating poll that came out about a year ago where they went around and they simply asked people, do you think too much political correctness is ever sometimes a problem? Really, really weak, allowing people to voice their doubts in this really, really weak, gentle way, right? Do you have any doubts? And about 80% of them said yes. And the thing is, as long as that 80% is the 80% of the population that doesn't matter and doesn't have any mechanisms by which they can be made to matter, that's really cool. And actually what that does in the psychology of the true ruling class, it develops the psychology that I kind of inherited from my communist grandparents, my father's parents, who were, communists basically from the 30s or maybe even late 20s through the 70s, where they have this sense that every aristocracy kind of has that you're sort of beleaguered by the peasants. And the more beleaguered by the peasants you feel, the more asabiya, the more togetherness you feel, and actually the stronger and stabler the regime becomes. Whereas what happens in the USSR and East Germany in their later days is that they start losing the support of their upper classes even in the 60s. Because the 60s has real effects in Eastern Europe. You have the Prague Spring. You've got all these people wearing, you'll see movies from the time, movies made in like Czechoslovakia, Poland in like 69, 70. Everybody's wearing bell bottoms. Right? That's not that shows you where the wind is blowing, right? People are not adopting Eastern European fashions in Brooklyn. Oh no, it's going the other way. And that direction of the wind is really very, very difficult to oppose. And so when you basically show me all these proles and you say, well, here the power is with the people, first of all, it feels like you're repeating this kind of very, very stale 19th and 20th, even 18th century kind of propaganda about the power of the people. The second thing,
but I didn't say anything about the power of the people.
I know, but you implied. Well, then how is this a legitimacy
power in the present regime?
How is this a legitimacy crisis then?
I do think
why is it a problem?
I agree. Look, I agree with you on the basic point that it's even in a nominal democracy, in a nominal republic, a minority always rules, right? No question about that. Machiavelli says, I'm going to get the chapter wrong. Its discourse is like 138 or something. He says, in any republic, there are only 40 or 50 who command. I'm not sure I'm going to boil the number down that low, but it's low, right?
Not in this republic, but yes.
Their legitimacy does depend on, at a minimum, a kind of acquiescence from the bulk of the population. If 40 or 50% of the population knows that they can be pushed around at will, but also believes everything is a lie and that the ruling class is ruling solely for its private good and for the common good, you have a legitimacy problem there. And that's before you even get, if we want to be Greek again, to the Socratic question of, even if you can keep a thing going, right? Would Socrates say that the definition of legitimacy is simply whether you can keep a thing going, even if it's unjust and exploits the people and is anti the common good? I would say no. Even if you can make that arrangement go for 1,000 years, I would still dispute its legitimacy.